This lecture on counseling research concerns narrative research, interpreting lived experience, and also survey design. Now, I know we've already talked a lot about narrative research. And so why are we talking about it again? Well, this is pure narrative research. So there are specific objectives to that. We have used narrative research in other types of research, but again, this is pure principles of narrative research. It's understanding the process of interpreting experience. It's examining the phases of narrative inquiry. It's reviewing the elements of narrative research, the types, and then we're going to be looking at survey research, the types of survey methods, the steps, and exploring various approaches to survey data. Okay, the emergence of narrative research, it gives very specific data. It is pure storytelling. Let me put it that way. It offers a systematic way of approaching data and broadening the perspective beyond that of the therapist. Narrative research provides specific complexity and systematic data analysis. And it really helps you look into the window of the cognitive processes of the individual. There are a lot of variations of narrative inquiry, and you will recognize these and you'll kind of understand why this is research that is very specific. Biographies are narrative research. Life writing, personal accounts, personal narratives, narrative interviews, personal documents, life stories, oral histories, ethnohistories, all different kinds of particular narrative inquiry that you would think about when you thought about narrative research. Clarifying some terms. What is a story? Narratives told orally to recall events and describe experiences about people in a setting doing something for a purpose. And then the definition of narrative, both the methodology in which researchers engage and the text they create. More terms. The plot. Remember, we are storytelling. The plot, the narrative structure through which people understand and describe the relationship among the events and choices of their lives. The last term is restoring. It's a retelling of stories collected in narrative research, organized around literary elements such as problem, characters, setting, actions, and resolution. You're going to see a lot of the same type of issues if you are using narrative theory in counseling. Not too many people use narrative theory, not pure narrative theory. Again, some of the techniques in narrative theory, but one of the main things in narrative is restoring, which I find very powerful. I think you could probably use that in any theory to ask your client, okay, this is your story. How can we restory that in a way that is uses your ability to create and to see the future in a different way? A lot of influence of culture and narrative, because we are telling people's story. Their culture, their time, their place in which they live, it's got to be acknowledged in a discussion of interpretation. Because the symbols of storytelling are culturally based, we must understand narrative inquiry as being the production of a unique, free-willed individual living in a specific way within cultural bounds. People who go in and tell the story of a particular culture. I find the Native Americans are fascinating. What powerful, wonderful people they are. And to be able to tell their story would be very exciting for me. It's imperative for narrative researchers to have knowledge about the culture. Of course they do. So you may want to, this is again one of those research that takes time. Because you may want to go in and spend time in the culture and time with that person until you feel like you have an understanding. The phases of narrative inquiry is attending. We just talked about that. Attending, being a part, participating, understanding, and then telling their story. This is why participation is so important, that you are part of the individual and you're telling their story and you want them to participate in that. Then you are transcribing the story, analyzing the story, and then you are writing it in a way where that story can be generalized to other people and they can understand that particular person or culture. And then the last phase, reading, of course, reading what you wrote and make sure it says exactly what you want it to say. And that's when you get other individuals, colleagues, other individuals in the culture to make sure that you've written the story well. When you select research participants, you have to attend to the relevant characteristics of the experience and then purposely select individuals who meet the criteria and have stories to tell related to the chosen research question. Narrative researchers typically select participants that are have the breadth and the depth of information that they really want concerning that story. Even with narrative research, you're going to have to review the relevant literature because you're going to make sure that it's part of that understanding. It's part of being a part of it and knowing what's been written before. Maybe not about that particular subject, but you do want to read as much as you can about that particular subject if there has been writing on that. Narrative researchers must continually strive to balance their theoretical influences, a narrative influence, with the interpretations provided by their informants. Eliciting stories. How are we going to gather those stories that are heart of narrative inquiry? Maybe it's sitting with the person, asking them to tell their story, sitting in the group of the culture you're studying and hearing them talking about their stories. Of course, interviews, whether it's individual or group, observations that you are observing them, and review of public or personal documents that you would use to help elicit the stories. Whether you call them research interviews, conversations, or oral histories, those are usually the method of choice. How else are you going to find out what their story is? The eliciting question is very important. But I think eliciting questions or open-ended questions are very important in counseling generally, that you learn to ask very good questions that are going to lead the individual in sharing what you feel like you really want to hear from the individual. Questions are very much a part of postmodern theories. Questions that help lead the client into sharing their stories. Triangulating stories, we talked about that a lot. You're going to see, as I said, I feel very redundant with this because we've already talked about this so often. It's just multiple sources of data, multiple methods of collection, multiple investigators. Is a strategy recommended by most qualitative inquirers, whether they're doing theory, whether they're doing case study, or whether they're doing phenomenological, or whether they're using narrative qualitative. Triangulation is a big source of data. Asserting that narrative research includes 4 analytical processes. Retelling an individual's story, because that's your job as the researcher. You are doing a narrative study for this phenomenon, for this culture, for this person, and you want to retell that individual's story. And then you want to identify themes within their story, whatever those themes might be. Situating the story within a specific setting and placing an individual's life events in chronological order. With narrative research, chronological order can be very helpful. If you're telling an individual's story, whoever that individual might be. You might want to tell the J.D. Vance is a very interesting story in life. And so you would really want to, I think he's already told his story, but you might want to write it in another way. Very chronological order: when he was young, when he was a teenager, when he went to college, when he went into the military, when he went to law school, when he decided to run for political office. You could really dive into the depth of what was going on with him, and putting that in chronological order would certainly help you understand that individual's story. Listening to voice. I just think as therapists, we have got to have the ability to conceive of someone's experience, whether it's in personal counseling, whether it's in research. We have got to be able to listen more with just that than just our ears. We have really got to be able to listen to the individual's story, understanding their story, hearing that little bit maybe of emotion behind the story, hearing that when they get to a certain point, they change their story. I've done that a lot with clients, and that they'll be going along, and that all of a sudden when they get to a place they really don't want to talk about it, they'll change the topic very quickly. So listening for those things so that you can bring that person back. Did you know that when you were talking about that? It's one of those good listening questions. Did you know when you were talking about that you suddenly were unable to continue and you changed the subject? And they may say, no, I really wasn't sure about that. And you can say, can we go back to that place? And can we continue in that so that I can hear more of your voice? Self in story. Understanding yourself and your feelings and your thoughts, very kind of psychoanalytic, very Jungian there, understanding yourself, who is self, relationships in the story. Who was important to you? Who was your mentor? Who changed your life? Who did you have to walk around? What was the blockage? There's lots of issues with relationships in a story. And then your cultural framework in the story. Let's go back, since I mentioned J.D. Vance. I'm not sure if it was the hills of Kentucky, but somewhere in that area, that it was, the culture was very strong and very important to telling his story and listening to his voice.